The early record business, Edison, Victor, and Columbia, were the original three companies in 1890 until 1950. So you're thinking about it, it's 60 years these three companies dominated all of the recording industry. And in 1900, 3 million records were sold in the U.S. So that's pretty considerable considering it was 1900. In today's terms, it's a really small amount. So recording in the 20s, all recording devices were mechanical until the 1920s. What I mean by mechanical is that the musician would have to gather around this conical kind of air gathering device that they'd sing or perform into, and it would be a physical device that was actually moving a diaphragm and creating a recording. Nothing electronic at that time, or magnetic. So they would all crowd around a room, and they'd modified instruments so that they could get really close together so that they could play into this one horn-like kind of recording device. They had to control their dynamic range because if they got too loud, it would scratch off the wax-coated paper that they were recording on, and you could only do a few instruments at a time. You couldn't do a whole symphony. It would be very difficult. And in the 1920s, it would kind of look like this. First recordings were of black musicians in the 1920s, and then the business boomed until the late 20s, then started to decline due to the Depression, and radio actually had an impact on buying recordings because if people could turn on the radio, this is the same argument people had when streaming came around. Well, if you could stream, then why buy music? You could just turn it on and hear it anytime you want, right? So why even own it? There was excessive competition at that time because people realized that this was something that you could actually make money in, and there were 150 record companies in the late 20s making records and competing with each other. Pretty exciting time for the recording industry. So the origins of magnetic recording go back to the early 1900s again. Danish inventor created the first recording device that actually used a wire and was used in recording studios. In 1920, innovation came along. In 1924, Western Electric, which was a part of AT&T, experimented with electronic amplifiers. They originally invented the radio, and instead of straight air vibrations, they could record onto a cylinder or a platter. And this was a huge breakthrough in the music industry. Due to the fact that now we could use electronics, they created microphones that fundamentally changed the process of recording, because if a microphone could capture the sound, you could put multiple microphones around a room, then people wouldn't have to gather around one little device to try to record, and you could use electronics to gather all that sound, mix it together, and record it. It was a whole different thought process. It was a really important breakthrough in the industry. Most of the audio developments were developed because of film. Film was in its infancy as well, and the film people usually thought that if you had great audio, instead of having a piano player playing to silent films, if they could develop actually audio with the visual, that would create a huge boom in people going to see entertainment and movies. So they were developing sound recordings as well for film. There was no good way to synchronize the sound to picture, and it was very difficult, but the first actual recording for a movie was The Jazz Singer, and it actually uses discs, and you'd have to time the discs with the movie when you'd watch it. So optical systems were usable in 1929 and used until 1980 for movies. Optical systems meaning they imprinted the audio in a piece of film that was actually physically locked with the image film. In the 80s, I used to work in film, and we had these mag machines. They were huge machines that had this huge reel of film with sprockets on the side, and one was an audio machine, one was a film machine, and you'd actually, if it was not synchronized when you're watching it back, you'd actually move a sprocket and go, no, 3 sprockets back or 3 sprockets forward. And it was a physical synchronization device. Later, of course, technology got to the point where they could control the drive mechanisms of these machines and synchronize them, but at that time, that was the best way to do it. So sales of recording equipment to the film industry kept the technology alive, and the first recording sold to consumers was Fantasia, which was a Disney film, actually. Magnetic recording started up and was used in the 30s, and it was used in Germany through the 1930s. The BBC used it, and in the late 30s, record sales got back to the highs of the 1920s and helped jukebox sales, helped quite a bit in terms of making music popular and being able to distribute to the masses. But the industry was still going through a lot of troubles in terms of getting its feet on the ground and having real traction in terms of audiences wanting to buy music and keeping the industry going. Recording in the 40s, stereo was envisioned in the 30s, but was never commercially instituted. And the first two-track tape head machine was 1943 in Germany. So 1943, less than 100 years ago, the first stereo recording tape head. First consumer recordings that were stereo were on reel-to-reel tape. There was a huge need for recordings during the Second World War. And one of the things that was really important is on the front, the war front, they could go ahead and have recordings. And so recordings were used to entertain the troops. It was used for propaganda, obviously, because we were in a war. And it was used for journalism.